Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Dillman. I'm ACM's Director of Publications, and for the next 20 minutes, we're going to talk about open access and sustainable open access, hopefully. First thing to tell you about, that's great, that's working, is that about 4 years ago, ACM took a decision that it would switch to a mandatory open access policy as of the end of 2025. Steve? And for the last 4 years, we've been working with quite literally thousands of institutions around the world, about 2,600 institutions that were historically subscribers to our digital library, which essentially was ACM's sort of medium-sized deal or big deal, where they subscribed, paid one price, and had access to all of our publications, all of our conferences, all of our journals, all of our other titles in the ACM Digital Library platform. And we launched that in January of 2020, just before COVID, perfect timing. And then in June, our council, which is essentially ACM's board of directors, took a decision that it would go mandatory. And so for the last 4 years, we've been working on that plan. And just last week, our council took another decision. Every year they wanted to look at the data, see how we were progressing, and then kind of reaffirm their commitment to this transition. And so last week, they took the decision that we will, in fact, transition to 100% open access at the end of next year. That does not mean that we are sustainable yet. In fact, we are not sustainable yet. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where we are and show you how we're progressing, and then some of the risks to sustainability for ACM. We can get into, I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then I really want to have a dialogue with you, answer questions, talk about ACM's model, how it's a little different than maybe some of the other models that are out there, like Subscribe to Open and Diamond OA. Ours is actually quite a different model. One of the reasons why we decided to go full OA was not necessarily just because of Plan S or all of the funder mandates that were coming down around the world by governments. It was because the data that we had collected over a period of years showed that when we publish an article open access, that article is getting downloaded 200 to 300 times more, and it is getting cited about 70% more than when it is published behind the subscription paywall. And that's what really drove our community back in 2020 to demand that ACM become an open access publisher. We're a nonprofit, mission-based, and the goal is to distribute and accelerate science to the greatest extent possible. So our scientific mission and our educational mission really took over. And that has driven a lot of the decisions that ACM has made over the last few years. So let me talk a little bit about where we are today. So we had about 2,600 subscribers that were generating collectively about $23 million a year. And as a publisher, we had a very, very low surplus margin. We don't call it a profit because as a nonprofit, we actually channel any surpluses back into the organization and back into the growth of the organization. So we don't have shareholders, we don't have any private owners that the money goes to. It all stays within the scientific community. Out of that 2,600, as of today, we've transitioned about 1,630 institutions, which represents over 60% of the institutions that subscribe to the digital library. Over about 60% of the revenues that we historically had generated from subscriptions are now coming through ACM Open licenses. I'm looking around the room and I see a bunch of the ACM Open institutions. In fact, a few of them were some of our early adopters, so thank you. And you can see, looking at the map, the distribution of where those adoptions are coming from. I want to point out one country in particular that's a real challenge for us, and that's China. You'll see in China there's 13 institutions that have joined, including 2 very large institutions, Tsinghua University and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. But most of the others have been very small, low publishing institutions. This is actually a huge issue for us because China does not have an open access mandate. And there is not a lot of pressure coming from the government driving the institutions to sign on to these kinds of institutional read-and-publish deals. That's a huge challenge for ACM in particular because about 30% of what we publish comes from China. And that's been growing for the last decade. And actually in 2021 surpassed the United States in terms of publishing output. So the entire sustainability of the model depends to a large extent on whether China will actually adopt the open access model, either through the read and publish deals, through the institutions themselves, or by their individual scientists that are publishing with us, paying APCs. That's an open question, and we're waiting to see what happens. So just looking at our publications by region, you can kind of see generally where our authors are based and what that distribution looks like. And again, point out China because that is a big issue for us. The model itself, I don't know how many, quick poll, how many people in the room are familiar with the ACM Open model itself? It's what we call an unlimited read and unlimited publish model. So what we do is we look at each institution's historical publishing output. We take the average number of articles where the corresponding author is affiliated with that institution over the past 3 years. And then we apply, we look at that data and then they get fitted into one of these tiers. It's a 10-tier system, tier 1 being the largest institutions, tier 10 obviously being those small, relatively low publishing institutions. And you can see how many institutions have joined from the various tiers. Tier 1 is obviously the largest, and when we started this back in 2020, there were actually only 20 tier 1 institutions. But over a period of 4 or 5 years, we've seen huge increases coming largely from China and a few other countries. And now today, over 20 of those tier 1 institutions are from China. So again, I don't want to pick on China, but that is a huge part of the sustainability issue that we have. But you can see the progress that we've made in every tier around the world. You can see the growth by year. Over the last 2.5 years, we've seen tremendous growth, and we're expecting that by the end of 2025, we will have about 2,200 institutions having joined the model. Most of these licenses are multi-year licenses. Not all of them, but most of them. There are countries around the world that don't allow multi-year licenses, but most are 3-year or 4-year licenses. So not quite where we need to be, but we will be over 70% of the revenue that we need to be a sustainable open access publisher. And the remainder of that income will come from APCs, we hope. And hope is not a great strategy, but there are early indications when we look at optional APCs, authors that feel strongly about using research funding to make their articles open. We see a lot of growth over the last few years in the optional titles that we have for optional hybrid open access. And the expectation is that when we move to a mandatory model, that there will be a sufficient amount of income to be sustainable over the longer term. Not going to go into a lot of detail here, but one of the things that we were really committed to when we launched this open access model, and one of the reasons why we were committed to total transparency on financials, is that we were asking institutions to pay a lot more money if they published more with ACM. And if I think about the average tier 1 institution, which is the extreme case, the average tier 1 institution was paying about $10,000 a year for access to all of our publications. And in the new model, they're paying about $95,000 a year. On a pure financial basis, that's a huge increase. When you look at how many articles are getting published for that, if I look at some of those tier 1 institutions, we've got institutions that are publishing 200, 300, almost 400 articles a year, and they're paying $95,000 a year. So you kind of do the math and compare that to an APC. And there's value there, but nevertheless, a huge increase for many of these institutions. I'm putting up this P&L because we actually publish this information publicly every year. And when we told those institutions that we needed them to pay more in order for this model to be sustainable, we had to make a commitment to being transparent about the finances. So every year we publish an article in our flagship magazine, and it details in even more detail than this exactly what we're spending on our publishing program, what it costs to run a journals program, what it costs to run a conference program, how much our printing costs are going up every year. All of those details are in there. And you can see that at the end of the year, in 2023, our expenses went up tremendously. This was for a variety of reasons. One was that we invested more heavily in our digital library platform. One was that we had a COVID effect. There was a huge increase in the number of published articles. That it took a couple of years. There was a bit of a lag. But in 2023, that number went up tremendously. And that cost us about $1.5 million more in production costs. And so in terms of sustainability, it is a bit of a moving target. When we started this back in 2020, we were based on 2019 numbers. Our total expense line was about 23, almost $24 million. And now it's about 29 million. So expenses rise, costs rise, and that means that over time, ACM has to generate more income or cut costs. And so we're looking at both of those things. By the income, this is sort of what we're looking at for ACM open income. This does not include APCs. There is non-digital library income. We do some advertising, we run a job board, we do some other things that generate income that will move us closer to sustainability. But if we're thinking about digital library, it's about $23 million, which means we need to generate about $5 or $6 million a year in APC income. Okay, enough of the data. So talking about the risks that we have. First and foremost, we are dependent almost entirely, if you can look at those numbers that I showed before, on APCs. We very much wanted to avoid that situation. When we launched this model, it was launched as an unlimited read and unlimited publish model, specifically because we knew that our community, the computer science community, did not like APCs. They didn't want to pay them. Some of this goes back to the roots of computer science, the open source movement, software movement, which is a free movement. A lot of the people in our community are really, really against paying for publication. And so there are risks that go with that. We don't know at the end of the day whether our authors are going to submit papers, pay APCs, or go to alternative publishers. In our space, IEEE, Springer, Elsevier, and a few other publishers have viable publication outlets for them, and they're not mandating the payment of APCs. So this is a big risk for ACM. And we're going to have to see how that plays out. There's some things that we're going to do to mitigate that risk over the next couple of years, but that remains an enormous risk. What happens when we unlock the paywall at the end of next year? Will those institutions that are not publishing very much with ACM, will they go away? Will they cancel their subscriptions? I liken this part of our model to subscribe to open. And it's a big question mark for us. We don't know when we unlock the platform if there are going to be extenuating circumstances that cause institutions to cancel subscriptions. For ACM, we've got about 1,000 of these institutions that fall into this category. So at an average of anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000 per institution, you're talking millions of dollars at risk. Whether or not those institutions choose to support the model and choose to support ACM is going to determine to some extent whether we are long-term sustainable. We're committed to flipping at the end of 2025, but if 2 or 3 years down the road, after 2026, 2027, and 2028, we're not able to generate enough income to support the publishing program, we can't cut out enough costs, this becomes a real question mark. Is open access going to be sustainable for ACM? Library budgets. How many people in here are worried about library budgets? So that's a huge challenge for us. And one of the things that we found with this model in particular is if you're at a research institution that publishes a lot, your library budgets are not enough. What we have found with many of our institutional subscribers that have moved over to ACM Open is that they've started working with the computer science departments, the electrical engineering departments, and actually done some cost sharing. Some of our biggest subscribers have actually partnered with the departments to actually share costs. Budgets exist. There's no lack of funding in computer science. You can't really open a magazine or a newspaper these days without reading about generative AI or other forms of AI. And we are one of the largest AI publishers in the world. There's tons of funding. But it's over in the departments. And so how do you tap into that? You've got to talk to the department heads. You've got to talk to faculty. We've actually done some matchmaking over the last few years. We've actually introduced department heads and deans to their librarians because they didn't know who they were, strangely enough. So there's got to be a lot of that. China, I talked about. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Editorial is really the other big risk. At the end of the day, if we flip to open access, we generate enough income to be sustainable, but all of our best authors go somewhere else, we've just shot ourselves in the foot. And that's going to be an enormous problem for ACM. And so the organization right now is less worried about money than it is about losing quality authors and quality papers. And so over the next 14 months, we are working on solutions to mitigate some of those risks. That may be some short-term discounts on APCs. It may be bundling APC, some of the APCs into conferences, because a lot of our content comes from conferences, and other things that we're looking at. And then, the other main risk that I would just point out is sort of the whole open access ecosystem, I think, is under threat. I mean, we see a lot of challenges to Plan S. We know with the elections in the US, there's probably going to be some challenges to science funding. Congressional support for these mandates may not be there. So we'll have to see how it goes. Those are the slides that I presented, and I wanted to open it up for the remaining time that we have to questions and really anything that I can answer for you.
So at the end, we talked about federal funding. And at my institution, I will say departments don't have the money. The colleges do, and they don't necessarily distribute it. So at my institution, computer sciences and engineering, yes, has lots of money, but the computer science department doesn't necessarily have it. My concern is that in an APC model, our authors in computer science, they have external funding to pay for the APCs.
Yep.
So it's not coming from institutional dollars. And while my institution absolutely supports open access and the libraries contribute heavily, to me, the sustainability issue is where do the dollars flow from to get redistributed to societies and publishers who are trying to participate in open access to scholarship.
Does your institution publish a lot
Yes.
in computer science?
In conference proceedings, yes.
Yeah. So the big question for us is going to be whether or not those authors are willing to use their funding to pay APCs. And while it's a huge question mark for us, if they're willing to do that, then we're okay with that. I mean, we don't want to force institutions into a model that doesn't make sense for them. But we're very nervous that at the end of next year, authors may vote with their submissions and go elsewhere. If they're willing to support those conference fees, and those fees, by the way, are for a conference, it's about $700 is an APC. So it's not the thousands of dollars that you'll see with many commercial publishers, but whether or not they'll do it is a big question mark. So it may be okay, and there is another option. I didn't put into the slides, but we are introducing a freemium model. So our database is more than just a full text article database. It's also a very large bibliographic database. And so there will be an option for your institution to continue subscribing to the database for the bibliographic information, where the publicly accessible version with all of our published articles will be freely accessible. So the income that we generate from that bibliographic database should hopefully help towards the sustainability. But again, it's unclear exactly at what level that's going to be. So.
Maybe at the beginning we get at this, Scott, but I'm interested in what the benefits are for the tier 10 institutions, those small ones.
Yep.
After you go fully open, they need to have some reason to justify continuing to contribute that amount. So what are your plans around that?
Two main benefits. One is when they join, typically a tier 10 is publishing between 0 and 3 articles a year. Right? So if they publish 1 article a year, typically the cost of that, plus the access to the premium version to this bibliographic database, is the value proposition for them. The reality is that most of these institutions already have the budget. And for those tier 10s, we've actually been lowering the price.
Yeah.
So over a period of time, they're paying less, not more. And they have that budget. So the question, and this is a similar question to Subscribe to Open,
Okay.
will they continue when they have a free version? Is the free version going to be enough for them? If there is one student and one faculty member at the university, and they're publishing 1 article with us a year, is there enough value there? We don't know. We'll have to see. But that's the basic value proposition, is we're not going to ask anybody to pay more in that category, and we've been gradually lowering the cost for those institutions over the last 4 years.
So the major benefit is access to the bibliographic, the metadata that A&I, as we used to call it, abstract indexing part, right? But then also for a while, it's access to all of the back content that hasn't been made open, right? Because when you flip, you're only going to be flipping?
No, we're actually flipping
You're
it.
doing everything?
We're opening everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
I missed that, thanks.
And it's supporting the ecosystem. So
Yeah,
if we see 500 cancellations in 2026, we have a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Others?
I like the idea of the conference. Are there other models or things that you're thinking about? I'm thinking even like the user or individual researchers, because sometimes that we just, I mean, like we have, in our example, we have 40 institutions under us, and we might have 3 or 4 that are publishing heavy and the rest of them aren't. Still want to kind of get them on board, or maybe there's just that one particular faculty at this institution who's got code to publish with you.
Yeah, so certainly APCs, individual members, actually, ACM members, we are a member organization. We've got about 110,000 members around the world. About 20,000 of those 110 actually pay an additional fee to have access to this digital library. And we're thinking about, either deep discounts to APCs or throwing in an APC along with the membership. We are thinking about some membership-related models.
Like if they could pay extra and then publish for a year with you,
Yeah.
things like that I'm thinking, or even like.
Packages of
student models.
APCs. So we're thinking about a lot of different things. We will probably start selling some advertising on the publicly accessible version of the digital library. It's not going to generate a ton of money in the beginning. We're looking at sponsorship models, so reaching out to foundations to see if they're willing to make up the difference. So if we're $3 or $4 million short, can we find private funders or public funders that are willing to actually contribute to make sure that this is long-term sustainable? That's another route. We're basically willing to try anything over the next year and a half. The one thing I will say is ACM has money in the bank. It has, over the years, it's accumulated and it invests that money and it's willing to spend that money. So if there is a shortfall, the board of directors that voted last week said that they will make up that shortfall for a period of 2 to 3 years. And so they're going to buy us some time to see how things go with APCs and to experiment with a few of these other models. And then we'll see at the end of 3 years, where are we? If we're very, very close, I expect it will continue. If we're moving in the wrong direction and we see lots of cancellations, then I think there will be some tough decisions.
If you see large cancellations, what's the plan?
If we see large cancellations, we're all going to panic.
Step one.
And I think we will probably, if we're talking millions and millions of dollars, we will have to sort of consider the plan. I mean, the good news is the way that our model works, these are typically 3-year, 4-year, and 5-year agreements. And in any given year, you're not going to go off the cliff. So even if we saw, institutions in Tier 10 decide that they didn't want to renew, in any given year, it would be limited to a certain number. And so, that's spread out our risk to a certain extent and protected us, in any individual year. But we'll obviously, after a 2 or 3 year period of time, we'll have a good sense of the direction things are going.